Let's start with a truth most people never hear, because it challenges the easy narrative of villains and victims. The avoidant really does want to apologize, not in some vague theoretical way, but in a deeply felt, emotionally loaded way. The desire is there, the regret is there. What's missing is not conscience. What's missing is a sense of emotional safety. For an avoidant, an apology is not just an admission of wrongdoing, it is exposure. It is standing emotionally naked in front of another person and saying, you get to see where I failed. And for someone whose entire nervous system is wired around self-protection, that feels dangerous. Apologizing doesn't feel healing to them. It feels like stepping into a threat. This is where people misunderstand avoidance the most. They assume silence means indifference. They assume distance means lack of care. But in reality, silence is often the last defense mechanism standing. When the avoidant thinks about apologizing, they don't just imagine the words, I'm sorry. They imagine the emotional aftermath. They imagine your disappointment, your pain, your questions, your need for reassurance. And their body reacts as if it's about to be overwhelmed. Psychologically, this goes back to how avoidants learn to survive emotionally. Many of them grew up in environments where emotional expression was punished, ignored, or made unsafe. Vulnerability didn't lead to comfort. It led to shame, rejection, or loss of autonomy. So they adapted. They learned that the safest way to exist was to minimize emotional exposure and maximize self-control. That strategy may have protected them once, but now it's sabotaging connection. So when an avoidant considers apologizing, their mind doesn't ask, is this the right thing to do? It asks, can I handle what happens next? And most of the time, the answer feels like no. Not because they don't care, but because they don't trust themselves to stay emotionally regulated if the conversation goes deeper than they can manage. There's also a philosophical layer here that rarely gets discussed. An apology requires acknowledging impact, not just intent. It means accepting that you mattered enough to be hurt, and for avoidant, that realization can be destabilizing. If you mattered that much, then losing you matters too. And that brings grief, accountability, and emotional weight they've spent a lifetime avoiding. This is why the apology gets stuck in their head. Rehearsed, rewritten, delayed. They may think about it late at night in quiet moments when defenses are lower. They may even feel a surge of courage until fear takes over again. Fear of being seen, fear of being judged, fear of being pulled into an emotional space they don't know how to navigate. And here's the paradox. The more important you were to them, the harder the apology becomes. If you didn't matter, apologizing would be easy. It's the emotional significance that raises the stakes. The apology becomes a doorway, and they're terrified of stepping through it might demand of them. So instead, they wait. They hope time will soften the pain. They tell themselves it's too late or that reaching out would only reopen wounds. But underneath all of that rationalization is a simple truth. The apology exists, but it's trapped behind fear. Understanding this doesn't mean excusing the behavior. It means seeing it clearly. Because once you understand that the silence is driven by fear, not absence of feeling, everything else in this dynamic starts to make sense. And the real question becomes this. If someone is so afraid of emotional exposure that they'd rather lose connection than risk vulnerability, what does that tell you? Not about your worth, but about the walls they're still living behind. Once you understand that the apology is trapped behind fear, the next layer becomes impossible to ignore. What they're really afraid of isn't the apology itself. It's you. Or more precisely, it's your emotional response. Because in the avoidance mind, your reaction represents everything they feel unequipped to handle. An avoidant doesn't picture a calm, contained conversation when they imagine apologizing. Their mind jumps stray, T to intensity. They imagine anger they can't soothe, sadness they can't fix, questions they don't know how to answer. They imagine a moment where your emotions become the center of the room, and suddenly they're responsible for managing something they were never taught how to manage. This is where their nervous system takes over. For someone with avoidant attachment, emotional intensity register as danger, not metaphorically, physiologically. Heart rate increases, muscles tighten, thoughts race toward escape. In that state, logic disappears. The body is no longer asking what's the right thing to do. It's asking, how do I get out of this without losing control? And here's the part that's hard to hear. The avoidant often believes your emotions will consume them, not because you're unreasonable, but because emotional dependency, real or imagined, feels like a trap to someone whose identity is built on self-reliance. They fear that once they open the door, they won't be able to close it. That one apology will turn into a long, emotionally charged conversation they can't regulate or exit without doing more damage. So they catastrophize. They imagine worst-case scenarios. Eudema. NDE explanations. You needing reassurance. You asking for vulnerability they don't know how to provide. And because avoidants tend to think in absolutes under stress, they don't see a middle ground. It's either full emotional exposure or complete withdrawal. There is no safe in between. Philosophically, this fear reveals something deeper. Avoidants confuse empathy with obligation. They believe that if they acknowledge your pain, they'll be responsible for healing it. And since they don't trust themselves to do that well, they choose the option that preserves their sense of control, silence. This is also why avoidants are especially triggered by emotional unpredictability. They don't know what your response will be, and uncertainty is intolerable to a control-oriented nervous system. And angry reaction feels dangerous. A calm but disappointed reaction feels worse. Tears feel overwhelming. Even forgiveness can feel threatening because it invites closeness they don't know how to sustain. So they hesitate. They delay. They wait for the right time, which never arrives, because the real fear isn't timing. It's exposure to emotion they can't script or manage. And from your perspective, this feels cruel. It feels dismissive. It feels like they don't care enough to face you. But inside the avoidant, the internal narrative is very different. It's not, I don't care. It's, I don't know how to survive this conversation without losing myself. That doesn't make the behavior acceptable, but it makes it understandable. And understanding is power, because once you see that their fear is centered on emotional responsibility, not lack of feeling, you stop personalizing the silence. There's another layer here that matters. The avoidant often fears that your response will expose their limitations, that you'll see in real time that they can't meet you emotionally in the way you deserve. And that kind of exposure threatens their self-image. It forces them to confront a truth they have been running from, that independence has protected them, but it has also cost them intimacy. So instead of facing that truth, they stay quiet. They convince themselves they're sparing you, or that reaching out would only cause more pain. But beneath those rationalizations is avoidance in its purest form, avoiding the emotional mirror your response would hold up to them. And here's the shift: F, or you. If someone is more afraid of your feelings than of losing you, that tells you everything you need to know about where they are emotionally. Not where you failed, not what you should have done differently, but the depth of the fear they're still letting run their life. Because when someone is truly ready for connection, they don't fear your response, they respect it. When an avoidant can't bring themselves to face your response directly, something else happens. And this is where confusion sets in for most people. The apology doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. Instead of being spoken clearly, it gets expressed indirectly in ways that feel ambiguous, frustrating, and emotionally incomplete. Avoidants rarely say, I'm sorry, I hurt you, and I take responsibility. That level of clarity requires emotional presence, and emotional presence is exactly what they're avoiding. So they look for safer routes that let them signal concern without risking vulnerability. They reach out casually. They check in just to see how you're doing. They like your post. They send a memory, a song, a joke that only you would understand. To them, this feels like extending a hand without stepping fully into the room. Psychologically, these behaviors are compromise strategies. The avoidance need for connection is real, but it's filtered through fear. They want to reduce the distance, not eliminate it. They want to test the emotional temperature without committing to the emotional labor that a direct apology would require. And in their mind, this feels considerate. It feels safer for both of you. But here's the problem. Indirect apologies don't resolve anything. They don't acknowledge impact. They don't restore trust. And they don't give you the clarity your nervous system is craving. Instead, they create a loop. Hope without resolution. Contact without accountability, familiarity without repair. From the avoidance perspective, these gestures feel meaningful. They think, I showed I care. They believe their actions speak louder than words. And in some cases, that belief was learned early. Maybe they grew up in environments where emotions weren't talked about, only acted around. So they equate presence with repair and proximity. With apology, but philosophically, an apology is not about proximity. It's about responsibility. It's not about reappearing. It's about reckoning. And this is the step avoidants struggle with most. Responsibility means naming the harm, not just softening the distance. It means staying present when discomfort arises, not exiting when emotions intensify. So instead, they hover, they circle, they saint, just close enough to feel connected, but far enough to avoid accountability. And from your side, this feels destabilizing. You sense the pull. You feel the unfinished business. You wonder if they care this much, why won't they just say it? The answer is control. Indirect apologies allow the avoidant to maintain control over the interaction. They decide the timing. They decide the depth. Decide how much emotional exposure is allowed. A direct apology, on the other hand, hands control over to you, to your response, your feelings, your interpretation, and that loss of control feels intolerable. There's also a hidden hope embedded in these indirect gestures. The avoidant is often hoping you'll make it easier for them, that you'll respond warmly, that you'll minimize the past, that you'll signal it's safe to move forward without revisiting the pain. In other words, they're hoping the apology can be bypassed. But healing doesn't work that way. What's unspoken doesn't disappear. It accumulates. And every indirect attempt that avoids responsibility reinforces the very distance they claim to miss. This is where many people get stuck. They interpret these gestures as signs that change is coming. And they wait. They engage. They soften. But without a direct acknowledgement, the pattern repeats because the avoidant hasn't actually confronted the core fear. They've just found a way around it. Understanding this is crucial because it prevents you from mistaking movement for progress. Contact is not closure. Familiarity is not repair. And attention is not accountability. And indirect apology may soothe the avoidance anxiety in the moment, but it leaves the wound intact. And the longer this continues, the more the imbalance grows. One person managing clarity, the other managing distance. So here's the reality that grounds this entire dynamic. Someone who can only apologize indirectly is still prioritizing self-protection over connection. And until that shifts, no amu, NT of closeness, will ever feel truly secure. Because real repair requires the courage to be seen where you failed. At this point, it's tempting to assume the avoidant silence is driven by pride, that they're too stubborn, too arrogant, or too emotionally detached to admit they were wrong. But that interpretation misses the deeper force at work. What actually stops most avoidants from apologizing, it's shame. Shame operates very differently from guilt. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, there's something wrong with me. And for avoidance, that distinction matters profoundly. Many of them can intellectually recognize their mistakes, but emotionally, those mistakes feel like proof of inadequacy. An apology then isn't just an acknowledgement of harm. It feels like a PU, blick confirmation of their worst internal fears. Psychologically, this shame often forms early. Avoidants frequently grow up in environments where mistakes were met with criticism rather than repair, where emotional needs were dismissed, or where affection was conditional. Over time, they learn to equate vulnerability with humiliation. So instead of seeing an apology as a bridge back to connectio, they experience it as a spotlight shining on their failure. This is why you may sense remorse without hearing accountability. The avoidant feels bad, but not in a way that moves them toward you. Their remorse collapses inward. It becomes self-focused, heavy, and paralyzing. They replay moments, overanalyze conversations, and internally punish themselves. But that internal suffering doesn't translate into outward repair, because shame doesn't motivate connection. It motivates hiding. There's a philosophical layer here that deepens the understanding. Shame fractures the self. It creates an internal divide between who someone believes they should be and who they fear they actually are. For avoidance, apologizing risks collapsing that divide. It threatens to expose a self they've worked hard to keep concealed, flawed, emotionally limited, and uncertain. So instead of apologizing, they retreat. They distance themselves from you not because they don't care, but because your presence reminds them of who they were in the moment they hurt you, and that reflection feels unbearable. Being near you brings the shame closer to the surface. Being away allows it to dull. This also explains why. Avoidants often struggle with repeated patterns. Shame doesn't teach, it suppresses. Without confronting the behavior openly, they don't integrate the lesson. They just reinforce avoidance. Over time, this creates a cycle where they hurt, withdraw, feel ashamed, and then convince themselves that staying distant is the kindest option for you and for them. From your side, this feels deeply invalida. You want acknowledgement, repair, and growth. But the avoidant is stuck in a loop where self-protection overrides responsibility. And because shame is such an isolating emotion, they don't reach out for support or guidance. They carry it alone, reinforcing the belief that they are fundamentally incapable of doing relationships right. What makes this especially painful is that shame can coexist with love. The avoidant may genuinely care, miss you, and even regret losing you while still being unable to face you. Shame doesn't erase attachment. It distorts it. It turns closeness into a threat because closeness increases the risk of exposure. And here's where perspective matters. When someone is acting from shame, logic and reassurance rarely work. Telling them it's okay or that, you understand doesn't dissolve shame. It can even deepen it by highlighting how much grace they feel they don't deserve. So they pull back further, convinced that staying silent is less damaging than revealing how broken they feel inside. Understanding this doesn't mean you excuse the harm or wait indefinitely. It means you stop interpreting their silence as superiority. It's not that they think they're above apologizing. It's that on some level they feel too far below. And this is the sobering truth that reframes everything. When someone is ruled by shame, they don't avoid apologizing because they feel too strong. They avoid it because they feel too exposed. Once you see how fear, emotional overwhelm, indirect gestures, and shame all intersect, you arrive at the core battlefield inside. The avoidant mind, the conflict between control and connection. This is the inner war they rarely articulate, but it drives almost every decision they make in moments that actually matter. For an avoidant, control isn't about dominance. It's about survival. Control means predictability. It means emotional containment. It means knowing where the edges are so they don't get pulled into something can't regulate. Connection, on the other hand, is inherently unpredictable. It introduces another person's needs, emotions, expectations, and reactions into the equation. And for someone whose nervous system equates unpredictability with danger, connection feels like standing on unstable ground. An apology is where this war becomes unavoidable. Because apologizing doesn't just acknowledge the past, it opens the future. It invites dialogue. It invites emotion. It invites response. And once that door is open, the avoidant can no longer control the direction, intensity, or duration of the interaction. They're no longer the one setting the emotional temperature. This is why avoidants often prefer distance over repair. Distance restores control. Silence restores equilibrium. They may miss why. Think about you, even feel the loss deeply, but the moment they imagine relinquishing control, their system pushes back. Control feels safer than intimacy, even when intimacy is what they crave. Philosophically, this reveals a fundamental misunderstanding about power. Avoidants believe power comes from self-sufficiency and emotional restraint. They equate vulnerability with weakness and autonomy with strength. But real connection requires a different kind of strength. The strength to tolerate uncertainty, to stay present when outcomes aren't guaranteed, to allow another person to affect you. Apologizing flips the power dynamic in a way avoidants find deeply unsettling. It places the emotional ball in your court. You get to decide how you feel, how you respond, whether forgiveness is offered or withheld. And for someone whose identity is built on minimizing dependency, that feels like surrender. So instead of choosing connection, they choose control. They manage the narrative inte. They rehearse conversations that never happen. They maintain emotional distance so they don't have to confront the reality of what they might lose or what they might need to give. But here's the irony. The more they cling to control, the more disconnected they become. Control prevents rupture in the short term, but it guarantees disconnection in the long term. You can't build intimacy while guarding every emotional exit. This is also why avoidants often feel stuck between longing and paralysis. They want closeness, but only on terms they can manage. They want connection, but without the vulnerability that gives it meaning. And that internal contradiction creates exhaustion because you can't suppress human attachment forever without paying a price. From your perspective, this den, AMIC feels confusing and one-sided. You're willing to risk discomfort for growth. You're willing to sit in difficult conversations. And it's natural to wonder why they won't meet you there. But the truth is, meeting you there would require them to let go of the very coping mechanisms that once kept them emotionally safe. Control has been their armor, and apologizing requires taking it off. This doesn't mean they're incapable of growth. It means growth feels threatening before it feels liberating. Letting go of control means trusting not just you, but themselves, trusting that they can stay present, trusting that they won't be overwhelmed, trusting that vulnerability won't annihilate them. And until that trust develops, they will continue to choose distance over depth, safety over sincerity. Thank you and control over connection. So here's the truth that grounds this entire point. Intimacy doesn't fail because of too much emotion. It fails when one person is more committed to control than to courage. After everything we've unpacked, the fear, the overwhelm, the indirect gestures, the shame, the need for control, there's a moment where the focus has to shift. Not because the avoidants suddenly see hangers, but because you do. This is the point most people resist because it feels like giving up hope. In reality, it's the moment you reclaim your power. At some level, many people are still waiting for the apology that explains everything, waiting for the words that validate the pain, waiting for the moment where the avoidant finally sees what they lost and says it out loud. And waiting quietly keeps you emotionally tethered to someone who is still protecting themselves from vulnerability. Here's the hard truth. Closure that depends on another person's courage is fragile. It places your healing in hands that have already shown you their limits. And when you do that, even unconsciously, you stay stuck in the same dynamic. One person carrying emotional responsibility, the other avoiding it. Psychologically, this waiting keeps your nervous system on alert. You're scanning for signs, reading meaning into silence, interpreting indirect gestures as potential breakthroughs, and every time nothing happens, the wound reopens. Not because the past hurt returns, but because the present keeps denying resolution. But something profound happens when you stop needing the APOL. OG. Not when you stop wanting it, but when you stop organizing your healing around it. The moment you release the expectation that they will show up in the way you needed, your energy shifts from external validation to internal authority. This doesn't mean you rewrite the past or minimize the harm. It means you acknowledge a painful reality. Someone can care and still be incapable. Someone can regret and still lack the capacity to repair. And accepting that truth is not bitterness. It's emotional maturity. Philosophically, this is the difference between attachment and self-respect. Attachment says, I need you to confirm my experience for it to be real. Self-respect says, my experience is real whether you acknowledge it or not. That shift changes everything. And here's the parado. Most people don't expect. When you stop waiting, the avoidant often feels it. Not immediately and not always consciously, but deeply, because the emotional tether they relied on disappears. The unspoken contract where you held space for a future apology expires. And in that absence, something finally reaches them, the consequence of their avoidance. This is often when avoidants feel lost most intensely. Not when you're chasing clarity, not when you're asking for explanations, but when you become grounded without them. Because avoidance depends on emotional distance, but it also depends on knowing the door is still open. When that door quietly closes, not out of anger, but out of completion, the avoidant is left alone with the very emotions they were avoiding: regret, grief, responsibility. And sometimes that's when an apology finally forms. Not as a strategy, but as a realization. But here's what matters most. Whether that apology comes or not, you are no longer waiting for it. Your healing is no longer on hold. You've moved from hoping they'll meet you emotionally to knowing you can meet yourself fully. This is not detachment in the cold sense. It's detachment with clarity. It's the understanding that love doesn't require self-abandonment, and understanding doesn't require endurance of silence. You don't need their apology to validate your worth. You don't need their acknowledgement to justify your pain. And you don't need their readiness to move forward with integrity, because the moment you stop waiting for someone else to face their fear is the moment you stop living inside it. As we bring this full circle, here's what this entire conversation has really been about. Not the avoidance apology, but the cost of waiting for it. You've seen how the apology exists, but is trapped behind fear. How your emotional response feels overwhelming to someone who never learned. How to stay present with feeling. How remorse gets expressed indirectly instead of honestly. How shame, not pride, shuts them down. How control feels safer to them than connection. And finally, how your healing was never meant to be dependent on their readiness. When you put all of that together, the silence stops feeling mysterious. It stops feeling personal. It starts to look exactly like what? It is a limitation, not a verdict on your worth. An avoidant may want to apologize and still be unable to. They may regret losing you and still choose distance. They may care deeply and still protect themselves first. None of those contradictions invalidate what you felt or what you needed. They simply reveal where that person is emotionally frozen. The real danger is not that they never apologize. The real danger is that you keep postponing your life, your peace, and your self-respect while waiting for someone else to overcome a fear they haven't chosen to face. Because the moment you stop organizing your healing around their potential growth, something shifts inside you. You stop chasing clarity and start embodying it. You stop needing answers and start trusting your own experience. You stop hoping they'll become braver and start honoring the courage it already took you to feel, to love, and to stay open. And here's the truth that lands hardest and heals deepest. The apology you were waiting for was never the thing that would free you. What frees you is realizing that you don't need someone else to be ready in order for you to move forward with strength, dignity, and peace. Because when you choose self-respect over waiting, you don't lose connection, you reclaim yourself.